So with that in mind, we're going to go to our next speaker, Dr. Jennifer Skeem, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Social Behavior and Criminology, Law and Society at the University of California, Irvine. I think she's covered everything there. She is president-elect of the American Psychology Law Society and was a member of the MacArthur Research Network on Mandated Community Treatment. She earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Utah and completed postdoc training at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Dr. Skeem's research is designed to inform clinical and legal decision-making about individuals with mental disorder, and I think Dr. Stedman talked some about what she is going to cover today. She has authored and co-authored over 90 articles, chapters, and books. To help research inform policy and practice, she works closely with both national and local agencies. Doctor?
Good afternoon and welcome back from lunch. I'm going to be talking about what Frank introduced in his talk as intercepts 4 and 5. So I'll be talking about people who have penetrated the system enough to become involved either in probation or parole. This is a really exciting time to be doing this type of research because many of you may or may not be aware that there is a lot of interest in recent years on reinventing community corrections, which is what probation and parole is. So there are a lot of very smart practitioners and scholars who have been researching what works to reduce recidivism risk for people in general who are on probation and parole. And there is also interest in this particular subpopulation. I want to begin by defining evidence-based practice because this is a term that is used a great deal in all sorts of fields, criminal justice, mental health, general health, et cetera. And I think different people mean different things when they use that term. I'm talking about that phrase in the sense that we want to apply the best research to improve practice, to inform practice that improves outcomes. There are different, very important outcomes that can be of focus with this population. Public health outcomes are obvious ones given that we're talking about mental health. I'm going to focus on what has been one of the predominant policy goals, at least for programs designed for this population, and that's the public safety goal. So I'm going to focus on the outcome of fewer new crimes, fewer new victims, and safe reentry, which is something that we're all interested in achieving for this population. And part of the recovery movement really is the idea that you can be out for life, out of incarceration for life. That's what reentry is really all about. And I also approach this from the context of operating in the real world. Everybody is broke. Doesn't matter which system you're talking about at this point. So it's really the optimal intervention, an interest in treatment principles that work rather than necessarily packaged programs. So trying to get inside the black box to really examine what is working when we find that something works, because those are the things we need to protect zealously with the few dollars that we have. So what I plan to do is really hit 3 points. The first is telling you what the problem is. Everyone's aware of that. That's why we're here. So I will do that quickly. And then touch on a basic model. It's an oversimplification in some ways, but the basic logic model that underpins most of the contemporary approaches that we have towards solving the problem of involvement of people with serious mental illness in the criminal justice system. And then I'll talk about what we're learning and recommending about expanding that policy model to really make more of a difference in recidivism and achieving effective reentry. So first, with the problem, we have people here who have done the best research to really tell us that people with serious mental illness are very much overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So as Hank said earlier, Linda Teplin has done the best work in this area. And if you aggregate across her data and focus on the prevalence of 3 serious mental disorders: depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And you simply compare the prevalence rates in the community, so the rates among your brothers, your neighbors, et cetera. You find that the prevalence rates of those 3 disorders are under 2% in the community, and that figure triples if you simply set foot into Cook County Jail. For women, the women in your communities, families, et cetera, are much more prone to depression to begin with. But again, if you move from the community to Cook County Jail, you find that those prevalence rates double. So this is what underpins the basic notion that these individuals are disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. Hank has updated these numbers, and he presented them elegantly earlier. But if you're just looking for an updated cross-sectional estimate of how prevalent are these disorders in jails, it's about 14% of men and 31% of women who are suffering from one of these major mental disorders. Most of my work has focused on community corrections, and this is because community corrections represents both a beautiful opportunity and a real challenge, because that opportunity often goes unmet. This is a simple depiction across time from 1980 until fairly recently, 2007, of where people are, those 7.3 million people who are under some form of correctional supervision in the United States. What kind of disposition are they under? You can see that we've had kind of an explosion over recent years. It slowed down, thankfully, recently, in the growth of the criminal justice population as a whole. But you can also see quite readily that probation always has been and continues to be the workhorse of the system. This is the most common disposition by far. If you put together probation, which is a sentence in itself, and parole, which is a form of conditional release after imprisonment, you've accounted for about 70% or more of people who are under correctional supervision. What we've learned is that when you compare probationers and parolees with a serious mental illness to those without a serious mental illness, they're about 2 times more likely to fail community supervision than their relatively healthy counterparts, which usually means that they will return to some form of custody and penetrate the system more deeply. That's the challenge. The opportunity is that we've seen that interventions for all kinds of criminally justice-involved populations are much more effective when they're provided in the community than when they're provided in institutions. So in theory, if the right interventions reach these people, we would have much better success with reentry. So we've arrived at the conclusion that we have many, many people who are on probation or parole who have a serious mental disorder, and they're about 2 times more likely to have a violation and fail and return to custody than their healthy counterparts. The Council of State Governments many years ago summarized the general problem well when they said that the current situation not only exacts a significant toll on the lives of people with mental illness, their families, and the community in general, it also threatens to overwhelm the criminal justice system, which is already overwhelmed. What are the contemporary attempts to solve the problem? This is a problem that has attracted a great deal of policy interest over the past decade especially, but people like Hank have been working on the problem for ages and drawing attention to it. So the contemporary attempts to solve the problem vary a lot. You've heard about some of them here today, mostly mental health courts. There are other forms of diversion like police-based jail diversion programs. Most of these programs are based on one perceived root, that there's a common cause that's perceived as the problem. And the Council of State Governments put it well when they said, people on the front lines every day believe too many people with mental illness become involved in the criminal justice system because the mental health system has somehow failed. They believe that if many of the people with mental illness received the services they needed, they would not end up under arrest, in jail, or facing charges in court. In some ways, this is a sort of specific statement that reframes part of the title of this symposium, the Criminalization Hypothesis. Given that this is the perceived root of the problem, most of the programs that have been developed for offenders with mental illness really place one thing at the center of their intervention. And because mental illness is perceived as the root of the problem, it won't surprise you to find that that one thing tends to be psychiatric treatment and symptom reduction. There are many, many different types of programs, mental health courts, jail diversion programs. I will talk about specialty probation and parole, forensic assertive community treatment. And they vary tremendously in where they happen in the system and how they happen, what main players are involved. But they tend to very much emphasize linkage with psychiatric treatment and symptom reduction in the context of other social services, but this is one of the main foci. If you were to unpack the implicit model, the logic model, and Hank did this earlier in a different form, so you're seeing the same graph in a different form, the idea is that you use the criminal justice involvement to sentence an individual to treatment or some kind of specialty program. That will result in them getting either more or access to psychiatric treatment, which will achieve symptom reduction, and that in turn will prevent recidivism and help achieve reentry. Again, it's an oversimplification, but it's important to do this to evaluate some of the assumptions in the model. Quite a bit of research from different domains suggests that the problem and the solutions that we need are quite a bit more complicated than that. If we just go for the gusto, many of the efforts to develop programs for offenders with mental illness try to adapt evidence-based programs for mental health and apply them to individuals who are criminally involved in the criminal justice system. If we look at the underlying premises, though, we notice that there may be some problems. Assertive community treatment is one of the best evidence-based programs for people with serious mental illness. It involves a multidisciplinary team that is involved to individuals 24/7, and it has been shown to very effectively reduce hospitalization, improve functioning, improve quality of life, etc. In one randomized controlled trial, Clark, Ricketts, and McHugo studied assertive community treatment versus treatment as usual in the community, and they found that assertive community treatment worked as advertised for individuals with co-occurring schizophrenia, typically, and substance abuse disorder. So reduced hospitalizations, improved functioning, etc. The problem is there was absolutely no difference between the two groups, either who got the Cadillac version of treatment versus treatment as usual, in their likelihood of contacts with the police or in their likelihood of arrest. 80% of these individuals over 3 years, regardless of what type of treatment they had been in, had some kind of contact with the police, which led these authors to conclude that those sorts of events are fairly common for individuals with co-occurring disorders, and that psychiatric treatment alone may not be sufficient to achieve the ends of reduced recidivism. We found mixed evidence for forensic adaptations of these models. As one example, there's forensic assertive community treatment, which involves a person who has some expertise in the criminal justice system along with the usual team members, and they see as part of their job reduced recidivism. There's mixed evidence on their effectiveness. We also, when we take a look inside the black box, find that when these forensic programs are working, it's not always for the reasons that we expect. It's not always because of symptom reduction. In fact, that's rarely the case. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this, focusing on specialty probation. And the whole goal, again, is to get inside the black box to see what is working so that we can do more of that for this population. I'm going to focus on the results of a probation outcomes study where we had 360 matched probationers with serious mental illness. Half of them were on traditional supervision right here in Los Angeles County. We picked Los Angeles as a match to the specialty site, which was in Dallas County, because there are similar expenditures on mental health, and we were able to match the probationers clinically, criminally, and demographically. So what is the difference between specialty supervision and traditional supervision? In specialty supervision, when you have a serious mental illness, you're assigned to an officer who is an MIMR officer, whose caseload is comprised entirely of people who have serious mental illness, and whose caseload size is usually less than half that of a traditional officer. There's also, as part of the model, a heavy focus on rehabilitation. Surveillance is part of the model, but rehabilitation is as well. And there's a particular emphasis on psychiatric treatment linkage. In traditional supervision, if you have a serious mental illness, you're assigned to any officer as part of a large generalized caseload, and the emphasis in this jurisdiction tends to be more heavily on surveillance. So what we found when we followed these individuals over time was that specialty probation worked. This was a very clear index of it working. This is a pretty big effect size, actually, for programs of this type. Those on specialty probation were about 2 times less likely to be rearrested during about a 5-year follow-up in this case, compared to those who were on traditional supervision. And this is controlling for everything under the sun. What this basically tells you, for those not familiar with survival curves, is that people on specialty supervision, here in green, were able to survive, live in the community without being rearrested over a 5-year period much better than those who were on traditional supervision. And if you look out at 5 years, it's about 60% still without a rearrest in specialty supervision, compared to about 33% in traditional supervision. So it works, which is great. It achieves the policy goal. But we also took a very close look at the logic model, because this is something that underpins a lot of different programs for this population. Is that reduction in rearrest because of symptom improvement? We know that those who were in specialty supervision got a lot more treatment. So the logic model was working in the sense that they got more dual diagnosis treatment, outpatient services, housing, et cetera. But what we found was that there were no differences between the two sides, traditional and specialty, in symptom improvement. So those on traditional supervision had a significant decrease in their symptoms over a 1-year period, just as did those on specialty supervision. And more importantly, if we just look at how much people's symptoms decreased over a year, there was no difference between those who did and did not succeed community supervision in their symptom change. Some people got a lot better and still got rearrested. Other people didn't get better and got rearrested. So symptoms didn't have much to do with recidivism. And this is similar to what Hank has found in other studies, that symptom change doesn't necessarily translate into reduced recidivism. We also, you don't have to look at this if you don't want to. I like research. We also modeled change in substance abuse symptoms over that 1-year period, and we found that substance abuse change also wasn't at the root of the reductions in the likelihood of rearrest for this population, which is consistent with a much larger literature. And I was talking with Hank and hesitating to say this with this group, but I think it's important to pay attention to data, because if you understand what's causing the problem, we're in a better position to fix it. So what we're finding is consistent with the larger literature, which suggests that mental illness rarely leads directly to crime. That doesn't mean it doesn't play a role, but that first category that you described this morning tends to be relatively small. And to give you a direct portrayal of this, Junginger and his colleagues in Hawaii did a neat study that's very easy to understand. They simply took 113 people with serious mental illness. They were ill enough that they were placed in a jail diversion program. So 113 people with serious mental illness. As they were being booked into the jail, they interviewed them to try to answer one question. Were your symptoms related to the reason that you got arrested, the reason that you're coming to the jail today? So between interviewing the people who were coming through the jail door and going over the police report, they were able to reliably rate the probability that their symptoms were directly driving the arrest. And what we see here is that only 4% of them, 4%, were hearing voices or had some kind of delusion that led directly to their being arrested. If you also consider symptoms like depression, etc., you might get up to 8%. So it's a small proportion of events that are attributable directly to mental illness. There were more people who were intoxicated at the time that they were booked, about 20%, or were committing a crime as an indirect effect of substance abuse, about 5%. But all of this is to say that it's not, mental illness is rarely leading directly to crime. All right. So, Professor Sachs introduced the symposium today by saying that one of our purposes is to really consider different perspectives on this issue. This is one alternative perspective to the direct cause model that drives a lot of what we do today. Bill Fisher and his colleagues have said that some people with serious mental illness may engage in offending and other forms of deviant behavior, not because they have a mental disorder, but because they are poor. Their poverty situates them socially and geographically and places them at risk of developing many of the same risk factors as persons without mental illness who are similarly situated. It would be a mistake to exchange one simplistic explanation, mental illness, for another, poverty. My purpose is to just expand your thinking about the nature of the problem. We're actually testing different aspects of this model, which is that oftentimes the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior may be an indirect one. In other words, mental illness places people at risk for experiencing third variables like poverty or trauma or disruptions in regular development. Often the onset of serious mental illness happens during adolescence, just when individuals are trying to establish pro-social peer connections, romantic relationships, set an employment, vocational life course, etc. So the notion is that these third variables that are related to mental illness in turn help establish general risk factors that apply to most other people that we see. And that is really what causes the criminal behavior. We found some support for this. So here in Los Angeles, we compared a group of parolees with mental illness to a group who had no mental illness in general risk factors, and found that those with mental illness had significantly more of those general risk factors than those without mental illness. What are those? They are things like having antisocial cognition, antisocial peers, family and marital discord, substance abuse. Many of these things won't be surprising to you. But what they tell us is that if we have factors like this that are helping to maintain involvement in the criminal justice system, it is important to target those as part of our strategy for promoting reentry. So this is a depiction of the current model, which is that you mandate treatment, we have mental health and other sorts of treatment, and sometimes for those events that are related directly to mental illness, that will be sufficient to achieve recidivism reduction. But we also need to look to a second evidence base, which is there's really exciting evidence for how to change criminal behavior. And I think where the research is now is really exploring how to adapt some of those interventions to this population to really make a dent in recidivism risk. I have not a lot of time, so I'm just going to touch on these final issues quickly. Some things that we have found in our research that work. I'm going to tell you just one example of what can be done in treatment, and another example of how treatment and supervision can be done more efficiently. So looking inside the black box to see what's worked. In terms of what, one of the important things to realize is that the strongest risk factors for recidivism are really shared by people who do and don't have mental illness. So paying attention to those when they're present in an individual is really important. And we found that in specialty probation, officers naturally do this. It's not that it's part of their model, but sometimes they actually do this. This shows, we listened to audio taped meetings between probation officers and their supervisees, and this shows criminogenic potential. The strongest risk factors are up here, the weakest risk factors are down here. Not surprisingly, in 90% of these meetings, mental illness was the focus of discussion. It is the master status that really defines these individuals. But we also found that some of the moderate risk factors were addressed in these meetings. 20 to 40% of the meetings touched on some of these other important risk factors for recidivism. And even some of the so-called big four risk factors for recidivism were touched upon in these meetings. We also know that the more time that you spend addressing those major risk factors, the less the likelihood of recidivism. We see this from other research. The second thing that I will tell you quickly is that the way supervision and treatment is done is probably as important as what the focus is. So going back to the study of specialty probation that I introduced earlier, this is another depiction of specialty supervision having a significant effect on criminal justice outcomes. So we're seeing that specialty supervision reduces the likelihood of revocation. That was explained by the quality of the relationship that those supervising officers had with their supervisees. So the higher the dual role relationship, the better. And I'll end by just giving you a loose description of what these relationships look like. This shows kind of a traditional supervisory relationship. Some quotes. The first time I met this particular probation officer, he let me know that he owns me. The first time I met him, he threatened to put me in prison. I got so damn scared and I didn't do anything. There are also more relational or authoritative relationships. Actually, the first question he asks is, how are you doing? And he really wants to know. For me, we all need encouragement sometimes to do the right thing, and it's okay as long as it's done in the right way. Talk to me, first of all. He said, I speak Spanish, I speak English. There's no reason to roll up in the paddy wagon if I'm going in a direction that you feel is going to be harmful to me. All right. So we have an inventory that measures these relationships. We found that this is not the same as the therapeutic alliance. It's about being firm and fair and caring. And it protects against recidivism no matter how high or low risk individuals are. And it also protects against recidivism regardless of whether you're mentally ill or not. All right. And I will actually stop here. Am I out of time? About? So this is very important to say to this group in particular. Nothing I have said obviates the need for psychiatric treatment for this population. There are many, many, many reasons to keep psychiatric treatment as an essential part of the policy model. What I'm arguing for is expanding that model to also pay attention to other risk factors that may be even more important if we really want to achieve that chief goal of getting them out of the criminal justice system. I'll tell you a couple of specifics about psychiatric treatment, why it belongs. The first is that about 10% of the time we do have offenses that are directly related to mental illness. And I don't have time to go into detail, but some of the most recent research we've done shows that those events do not cluster by people. In other words, it's not that you can find a particular type of individual or offender who consistently engages in these crimes that are directly motivated by mental illness. Instead, those rare events are sort of scattered throughout the population among a lot more events that are based on general risk factors. The second reason is cost effectiveness, and I am going to present this because it's been a topic of discussion here that we haven't touched on. Hank had data that were relevant too. Specialty probation, we found compelling evidence for its being cost effective. So this shows the year one total, year two total, and sum total. You can basically see that traditional supervision is more effective, especially if you go out to year two and consider the big picture, than specialty probation. But the cost effectiveness doesn't happen in the criminal justice side of the equation. So you're spending more money on reduced caseloads and specialty supervision. Those costs are offset by savings in rearrest and avoiding reincarceration. So you end up with no extra costs on the criminal justice side. But on the mental health side, there's a lot more outpatient services, but those increased costs are much more than offset by reduced inpatient costs. So you're preventing some serious emergency events that would happen in the hospital side of the house were it not for the psychiatric treatment. Which is why we're saying that you keep psychiatric treatment as one of the main lines, but really need to pay attention to the other side of the equation, which is shared criminogenic risk factors to reduce recidivism. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
For example, the most common reason someone is active in towers is a parole violation. The most common type for that is that they did not call their PO on time or did not visit their PO on time.
I love this question.
So do I. So the reason I bring that up is it's a very weird, it's very easy and simultaneously very difficult type of recidivism to avoid, especially when they've done it 15 times and have gotten literally 15 different 90-day sentences over their lives. Or these kinds of tic-tac violations versus someone who got another gun or had another, car that was sold.
Well, as it happens, I have a direct answer for your question right here. So, to complete the model, we have to address the question that you're raising, but I didn't have time to get to, which is, what about setting aside repeated criminal behavior, which is what I've been focusing on? What about returns to custody for other reasons, like technical violations of the conditions of supervision? And I think that another way that these programs, specialty probation and specialty parole, are very effective is because they tend to reduce stigma-based decision-making. I don't have time to present a lot of the research on this, but we have both experimental and observational evidence that goes along with these qualitative data. So we've had refreshingly candid probation officers say things like this. I think Hank may have been at this focus group. If there's a nutso on my caseload and he's just taking up too much of my time, when there's an opportunity to transfer him to another officer, I'll transfer him. Transfer is a light version of this. There's also a real effort sometimes to just build a case for revocation based on technical violations because supervising these individuals, especially on general caseloads, can be perceived as a real risk. And the way to end the risk for the officer is to get them incarcerated or off the caseload. So that's why we see, for example, that even though rates of rearrest for people who are coming out of prisons here in California are about the same, whether you're seriously mentally ill, like acutely mentally ill, stable mentally ill, or not mentally ill, revocation for technical violations and general return to custody differs quite a bit just as a function of how much supervision you have and how many requirements you have to follow. So it's an excellent question.
I would like to just follow up with you on a few points around this link of the risk factors for recidivism and treatment. So I guess the question is, who do you see as addressing the risk factors? Is this something that's done in a program? Is this something that, again, brings us back to the community solution? Because if you really think through those array of risk factors and think of, okay, who will do that?
Right.
So that's the first question. And then the related question is, who needs to know the answer to that? So, for example, is this something for the mental health court to know? Who needs to activate that solution of kind of the marriage of treatment and addressing risk factors? Is it on the legal side? Is it on the clinical side? Is it all of that? How would we get there?
So the answer to the question about, who does this, how do we achieve this, with this being addressing those general risk factors for recidivism, the answer is it could happen on either side of the equation. So in community corrections, for example, part of the movement toward evidence-based practice is to have, as part of the correctional program, have officers assess exactly the risk factors that I had listed and talk about those, address those as part of supervision. And that's the basis for the reductions in recidivism that I showed you very briefly in that slide. So I think across the board there's this individualized targeting criminogenic needs focus as part of supervision on the criminal justice side. But it can also be a focus on the mental health side as well. And we've worked with treatment providers for offenders who have mental illness, and they also are interested in knowing those risk factors, being able to address them. Many of the strategies like anger management, cognitive behavioral treatment that targets criminal thinking, those come from psychology. So the mental health side of the equation can be appropriate for addressing those issues as well. And I'm trying to remember the second part. Who needs to know? Everybody needs to know. So the Council of, one of the things that we've recommended is that in addition to assessing the severity of clinical need, that is, what is the level of functioning, what are the psychiatric problems, et cetera, a second dimension of assessment that needs to be part of this is assessing those risk factors so that people do know that, for example, they need to not only focus on getting the person to their mental health treatment session, but also stopping them from hanging out so much with their cousin who deals drugs.
So I have two quick questions. One of them is within the specialty probation model, have you been able to figure out whether it's the relatively smaller caseloads or if it's the specific model of intervention that's the more powerful predictor of success?
That is also a question that I love. It's impossible to answer that. Well, actually, it's not impossible to answer that question. We did a national survey where we found the 113 specialty agencies across the nation and contrasted their practices with traditional agencies. And we found that as specialty agencies increased their caseloads above the average of 48, they looked more and more like traditional agencies in their practices. So I think that it's not possible to do problem solving, firm, fair, caring relationships, et cetera, without the time to do that. It's much easier to just threaten incarceration. So I think that reduced caseloads are probably a necessary but not sufficient criterion for the specialty model.
And the second question was, the one piece of the data that you presented that surprised me was that accommodation, which I assume means housing placement, was as low a risk factor as it seemed to be. In our experience, the being homeless was a very high risk factor. So I was wondering if you had any comments about that.
The table that I showed, the focus there was simply comparing parolees with and without mental illness on those risk factors. So what that told us was that with this matched sample, the housing needs were no more pronounced for those with mental illness than those without mental illness. So this is in South Central Los Angeles, which may have something to do with the equation. Setting that aside, if we also used those risk factors to predict recidivism, and housing wasn't a major factor. Poorly structured leisure and recreation time and some of the antisocial features were. And that was true for both those with and without mental illness.
Yeah, and that was the piece that surprised me, I guess.
Yes, yeah. Me too.
I hope you say that you love this question, because I don't think Hank did. I'm with the Santa Barbara Police Department. I'm an outreach worker, and we have a program called Restorative Court, and we work with homeless individuals, most of which are dual diagnosed. And we have a really strong team. We have collaborative efforts. We handhold, take people to their psych appointments, get their meds and everything else. But probably the biggest issue we face is that they fall back into that old lifestyle. And we're constantly looking for some kind of a model or a system or thoughts that can replace. And it's got to be the same even when you just have people who aren't mentally ill, but they are committing all sorts of crimes. What can you do as a community to replace that lifestyle with something that's more positive?
Well, it's not easy. One of the first thing is there's a lot of evidence to back up your impression that it's hard to loosen some of those lifestyle patterns when people are going back to the same neighborhood, same peer group, same everything that they came from. And there has been some attention to this in larger literature with trying to place people, at least in transitional housing, that's sort of outside of that so that there's a step into it. Why don't I talk with you at the break about, there's a much longer answer to this question that I can tell you about too.
Two more, but I'll ask them quickly and in one breath. First, California is making a college try to use the notion of reentry courts, which are a version of problem-solving courts with respect to people who are being released on parole and, to some extent, people on probation. So question number one is, have you noticed anything about the direct involvement of a judge in supervision and ongoing support between those reentry type courts and the other probation parole situations you notice? That is, does the judge help the thing to work better? Second, in your continuum of risk factors for reoffense, you list psychiatric treatment. Did I get the exact term?
That wasn't on the list. So that list, there's nothing sacred about it, but there's a list of 8 robust risk factors that have been emphasized quite a bit in the correctional literature, and that's not one of them.
Well, I'm misremembering. You had a list of interventions, perhaps, one of which was psychiatric treatment, the others of which were housing supervision, the more typical elements of probation and parole. So my question is once again about language and what you mean by psychiatric treatment. I'm not so sure that we lawyers and judges in mental health and like courts are using that in the same sense that you are. So does psychiatric treatment mean passing pills and symptom reduction, or does it mean personal involvement of a psychiatrist in teams, or what does it mean?
So the way that we operationalized it in the model, and I hope this is responsive to your question, when we tried to test the logic model, we read the active ingredient as symptom reduction, improvement in functioning, reduction of substance abuse, and that could happen through taking medication, attending treatment, having a more stable life through social supports. So there were lots of different means to that end, but we actually focused on whether those changes translated into reduced recidivism, and that's where we find the model not materialize. All of those outcomes are important in themselves, however. The first question that you asked about reentry courts, I'll just say briefly, I don't know that much about reentry courts, but I do know anecdotally that when probation officers work with judges who get it, they think that the entire supervision enterprise works much, much better with this population.